Are you frustrated with how static your vocals sound? By the end of this video, you're going to know my secret trick for stereoizing your vocals, taking your small, thin mono vocals into the stereo spectrum. Let's get started. Hello everybody, Dylan Pines here with Musician on a Mission, here with another mixing tutorial for you. Today, we are going to be talking about stereo vocals. Now, it's a bit of a contradiction. You know, you always think about how much in the center you want your vocals to be, how present in the middle of the speakers. You've heard that on, I'm sure, dozens of different YouTube videos talking about how you never want to pan your vocals left and right. But what if you want your vocals to be wider? What if you want them to take up more room in your mix? So today, that is what we are going to be talking about. And we're actually going to be going through my own secret personal trick for how to clean up your session whenever you're trying to create these stereo vocals, because sometimes it can get just a little bit stressful as far as just how many different things are going on. So let's just dive straight into it. So I've got a song right here. It's pretty much mixed, but the vocals themselves, they're sounding just kind of a little bland. So let me show you what they sound like.
I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up.
I mean, it still sounds good, but it just feels like this is such a huge moment in the song. There's so much energy going on in the background that the vocals need to match that bigness, that thickness, that energy. And they're kind of just sitting on top. So I'm going to add my own little stereoizing function that I've got here, which we'll go over what this is here in a little bit, but it's just a bunch of different effects that I've added. Now listen to what it sounds like after this.
I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning what I...
Pretty dramatically different, right? Let me show you in solo what this sounds like. And it's obviously going to be a little bit much in solo. That's mostly just because I want you to be able to hear the actual sound of the effect. So here's before.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up.
And here's after.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up.
Very complex sound, right? So really what this is a combination of multiple different layers of different stereo effects. For me, that is the big secret for getting stereo vocals. It's never just one very obvious effect. It is lots of tiny, little, subtle effects that, when added together, create a thick vocal that takes up a lot more room in the stereo spectrum. So we're going to go over what my own personal layers are just for this particular vocal. But the cool thing with this is that, honestly, there are so many different stereo effects out there. You can tailor them to match your vocal sound. So just because I'm going to show you these 6 particular ones doesn't mean that these are the only ones that you can use. You can swap them out for anything. But before we get into that, I want to show you my own secret little trick just for organizing this. Obviously, we just talked about the fact that it's a combination of a lot of different sends. It's a combination of a lot of different effects. Now, in the past, what I've done is I've had to add, send after send on here to get the sound I wanted. I have to go down here, I'd have to go and create a bus. I'd have to grab a new bus, put the effect on, do it again. Grab a new bus, put the effect on the send, do it again. You get the idea. I'm not going to keep doing it. But what would happen is I would end up with like 6 or 7 different sends on my vocal that were all dedicated to just getting a wider sound. And it really started to stress me out just because it was so difficult to control everything together. Everything was just a little bit too independent. So what I started to do to save space is I would actually create what I call a master send, specifically one that I call my stereoize send. And it is right here. It's bus 65. I've actually made it as a track just to make it easier for all of you to see it. So if I click on it, check out what this is. The two big things that you need to be aware of with this is, one, look at all of the sends that are on this aux track, right? I've got a lot of different sends. These are all of the sends that I would have on my actual vocal track. Here's the other important thing. Look at my output. Right now it's set to no output, which means if I was to solo this and I was to turn off all of my sends, what's going to happen? Let's hit play. Nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. But there is stuff going through it. So if I turn all of these things on,
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning.
all we're doing is basically creating a send that is rerouting the flow of audio to all of these different channels, but is not actually outputting any audio by itself. It's almost like a switcher at a train station. You know, when you want the train to go one of like 6 or 7 different directions, but the switcher itself, it's just a switcher. It's not a whole different track that you could get on. It is the exact same thing with this. So the nice thing about this is that I can actually use my stereoized send, my aux track right here, as kind of like a master fader for all of these different effects. So what I end up doing after I've created all these effects, is I'll actually turn this all the way down, and I will do just like what I do with most of my other effects, which is mix it in subtly. Like if I was to hit play, let me solo that.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning. What I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning.
And I can just move it up and down until the entire effect sounds right to me. It allows me to control everything, which is just awesome. It makes the entire thing much, much faster. So now that you understand kind of a better way to organize these sends, since there's going to be so many, let's dive into what I actually have created for this. So the first effect I have is Ambience. And Ambience is really just reverb. And it's just a reverb that is very, very short and very, very wide. The main thing I want you to look at, I'm going to go over to details. I want you to look at the width right here, how it's so much higher than it usually would be. And then I want you to look at the early and late reflections, which, if you don't know what these are, just for reverb, all sound in the world is made up of 2 different parts, or really 3 different parts: direct sound, early reflections, and late reflections. Now, it's not really worth us getting into all of that right now because we could have an entirely separate video just talking about what those are. But basically, early reflections are a series of really, really fast delays that happen at the very beginning of any kind of room sound. So if I was to clap in a room, sound would bounce all over the walls, and those first few reflections, those first few echoes that get to my ear, those are the early reflections. Because they are so short and so fast, they're a lot easier to use for creating stereo width. And not only creating stereo width, but like a natural sounding stereo width. I'm not going to get a whole bunch of, reverb wash, because I don't really want that. I can add that somewhere else. I can add in more room tone if I was just wanting to create a bigger sound that wasn't necessarily just more stereo. So I've got my mix knob to where it's a little bit more early. I've got my width where it's a lot higher, and I've got a pretty short decay time. So let's listen to what this sounds like. And I'm just going to solo the chorus, and I'm going to just mute everything else to make this easier to hear.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning. What I called home is just where I grew up.
Sounds kind of weird by itself, right? But honestly, whenever you pair it with the vocals, it sounds pretty nice.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning. What I called home is just where I grew up.
So making this is very simple. Like I said, all it is going into your reverb, adding more early reflections than late reflections, upping the width. And then for me personally, I also like to create a pretty high room size and a very low pre-delay, which is usually not what you see for different kinds of reverbs that you're adding to an actual vocal. But when the room size is very large, it's easier to get that width that we're looking for. And when the pre-delay is 0, we're kind of gluing the reverb onto the vocals. And if we're wanting that wider sound, that's exactly what we're looking for. So now let's move on to the next effect that I've got in this chain, and that is a stereo slapback delay. So you've probably heard about slapback delays. They're those delays that are really fast, somewhere between 50 and 150 milliseconds that often get put onto vocals just to give them kind of like a sense of space or maybe a really cool, interesting vibe, especially if you're going for something that sounds like the 1950s, because that's such an iconic sound for 50s vocals. But most of them are mono. So if we were to create a stereo slapback, what's cool about that is we actually start to move stuff into the stereo field and we widen the sound of our vocals. So let's look at what this sounds like before and after. So here's before.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning.
Pretty interesting sound, right? So let me go in and check this out. It's really, really simple. This is a kind of a fancy looking delay, but honestly, all you really need are these two knobs right here. So let me turn off sync so you can see how fast they are. I've got my left channel delaying at about 60 milliseconds and my right channel delaying at about 80 milliseconds. And I really don't have much of a feedback tail at all. And I also got, a little bit of modulation, a little bit of top and bottom cut to kind of fit the delay into the vocal itself. And so what ends up happening is rather than having just a single delay in the middle, we have two very fast delays on the left and the right. And so we do get that same slapback sound, but when we mix it in subtly, it gives the vocals a sense of space, and also it gives it more width. And this is definitely something that I would mix in, not something that you really want to put on top of the vocal, because it can be a little overwhelming. You heard it right whenever I started playing it at the beginning. It was just a lot. I had to turn it down. Let's listen to the difference between a little bit and a lot.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home.
So that's a little bit. It just gives it a nice sense of space. Here's a lot.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home.
It's like an assault on the ears. It's just a little bit too aggressive. So definitely something that we want to mix in. Now, you'll see this on a few of my channels. I actually have a de-esser on here. Now, the reason for that is just because this particular vocalist is just a very sibilant vocalist. She tends to really spit out her S's and her P's and her T's. And a lot of my stereo effects were causing a buildup with that sibilance. So what I did is on effects where it was particularly bad, I just threw an extra de-esser on there. And that's something that you can do with any kind of stereo effects. If you're just getting too much sibilance, be aggressive with it. In fact, I think I get like 10 decibels of gain reduction on here because ultimately it's something that I'm going to be mixing into the background. So really, I just don't want to build up. It doesn't really matter if it sounds right or not. It's not going to be in solo.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what.
Yeah, I'm sure it sounds very weird by itself. Let me just solo this out.
And I'm tired.
Yeah, it does.
'Cause I'm learning what I call.
But it helps it to blend way, way better. So we've looked at ambience, we've looked at our stereo slapback delay. Now let's look at some modulation. Let's look at chorus. So chorusing is one of the most common stereo effects. You've heard it used on tons and tons of different instruments. You've heard it used in tons of different mixes. You've probably used it yourself. So it's something that for me, I never want to skip out on whenever I'm creating kind of my stereo-wise matrix. It's something I definitely want to add. This is really just Logic Pro's stock chorus plugin, but every DAW has a different kind. It does not have to be complicated. It does not have to be simple. There's not really a trick to getting the right chorus sound. It's just your ears. It's figuring out what sounds best to you. The big thing that I would say is you want to make sure that you've got a stereo spread of between, 75% and 150%, somewhere in there. Sometimes you don't want to make your vocals fully stereo. You just kind of want to inch them out in the right direction. But you never really want your chorus to be mono, because then if you do that, it's making the vocals thicker, but it's not necessarily making them wider, and that's not what we came here for. Let's listen to what that sounds like before.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning.
And after.
What I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving.
It gives it that classic kind of underwater sound. Especially if I was to have put this directly on the channel and mixed it in. It gets very, very aggressive. You start to get that weird Nirvana kind of sound. The big thing that I would say, if possible, you want to go with more subtle settings. A slow rate and slow intensity or depth. Intensity and depth are just the same thing, basically. That just means that the time and the pitch of the chorus is slowly moving up a little bit and down a little bit, which just makes it a lot easier to mix in. You know, if I was to be really aggressive with it, turn this up quite a bit, maybe make that really fast.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I call.
Really cool sound, of course, but it's way more of an effect, way less of just like a mixing tool. So we put this back where it was. So now that we've looked at chorus, let's look at ping pong delay. That's the next effect that I have in my stereoize matrix. So ping pong delay, super simple. All it is a delay that bounces from the left channel to the right channel and back to the left channel over and over again, rather than just sticking around either in the center or being a stereo delay where maybe each side is just a few milliseconds off. This is the one that is going to be the most audible, and it's going to give it the most length. It's not only going to make it wider, it's also going to make it longer in time. But for me, I'm okay with that. I think it really does give it a nice ambience, a nice sort of sense of space around it. And I mix it in quietly enough that it doesn't really change the vibe of the vocal in a way that I don't want. Let's listen to it before and after. So here's before.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning.
Here's
what
after.
I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning.
It's another one kind of like the stereo slapback where it's something that you're going to want to mix in pretty quietly. The higher you mix it in, the more obvious it becomes, the more like an effect it becomes. Now, as far as the settings for the ping pong delay, totally depends on what works best for you. For me, I like to have a pretty aggressive low cut and high cut because I want to fit it inside of the actual sound of the vocal. And then I don't like having a ton of feedback because then it starts to sound more like reverb, and I could just add reverb if I want that. Obviously, you want your mix to be all the way up as you want for every single one of these effects. You know, if you have an effect and it's on a send, you don't really want to have anything other than a fully 100% wet mix. And then finally, as far as the timing goes, that is just going to depend on your performance, on your particular mix, what sounds best with it. For this song, a 16th note sounded best, but there have been times that I've used an 8th note. There have been times that I've used dotted 16ths, dotted 8ths. I've used 16th triplets. I've used 32nd notes. It really just depends on what that particular vocal needs. So after ping pong delay, then I added in a little bit of microshifting. So microshifting is a very specific effect. It's something that, as far as I'm aware of, you have to actually buy a plugin to use. You know, it's not something that you can just like create out of different sounds. I could be wrong. Let me know in the comments. But basically what this is, it's modeled after a piece of tech that was really, really popular in studios in the 80s. And it splits a sound up into several different stereo delays that happen pretty quickly around the sound. Really, if you want to think about it this way, it was like the first stereoizer back in the 80s before, you know, doublers and stereoizers and all of these other effects became a little bit more popular. So there's a lot of different companies that offer different versions of this effect. You just have to find the one that, you know, fit your particular taste the best. For me, I really like a Soundtoys Microshift. I think it sounds really good. So let's do a before and after. So here's before.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning. What I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning.
It kind of sounds like an extra fast stereo slapback, right? Especially since we've left in some of the original dry vocal. Sometimes with this particular effect, you'll slap it on the channel itself, you know, and have a really, really high mix. And so you really only hear the effect. And that just has, again, a totally different sound. With that, you're going more for emotion and vibe and character and effect, and not so much just like a cool mixing trick. Here's what it sounds like by itself.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning.
Cool stuff. And the settings don't really matter. Again, it's going to totally depend on what sounds best with your vocals, what sounds best with your mix. The looser the delay and the more aggressive the detuning, the more stereo it's going to sound, but also the more obvious it's going to sound. And then just the different styles are just different tones. So again, find the one that fits best with your sound. And the final effect that I have in my stereo matrix is actually something that I don't really think I've seen many people use. It's a bit of a secret effect that I've started using myself, so I'm just gonna let you in on the secret. This is a Dylan Bynes original. Or maybe it is. I came up with it on my own. Maybe it's an effect that everybody uses. Who knows? But really what it is it's something that I started doing in order to create a thicker vocal, something that sounded like I was doubling. And then I started using it to not only create a more doubled sound, but also to create a wider sound. And that is basically messing with the formant of the vocal itself. So for anyone who doesn't know what a formant is basically just how open or how closed your throat is and your mouth is whenever you are singing or speaking. You know, everyone has different levels of formant in their particular tone. And it's important to say, it's not pitch. It's a whole different thing. So if I was to have a very low formant, if I was to open up my throat a lot, I would sound like this. I'd sound like a cartoon character all of a sudden. And on the flip side, if I was to close my throat and have a high formant, I would sound like this. I would, again, sound like a cartoon character. But the cool thing is if I was to sing a note, if I was to sing that same note, with a low formant, it's the same note. If I was to sing that same note with a high formant, same note. So what I've done is I've done a little bit of subtle formant shifting so that it sounds like three different singers are singing at the same time. And I've added a few extra things that I'll talk about in a second. But the first important thing, if you have a plugin that can do this, and there's tons of different plugins on the market that can, you want to make sure that you put it in dual mono mode. So in Logic Pro specifically to do that, just instead of selecting stereo, you want to select dual mono. And what that does is it allows me to affect the left channel and the right channel separately. So for me, what I did in the left channel, I just pitched the formant down by 1. And then I added a little bit of detuning, just to help it, again, thicken up. And if my mix ever gets summed to mono, it helps it keep it from phasing. And then in the right channel, I went down by 2. And again, added just a little bit of detuning. So let me show you just what that sounds like by itself.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up.
Sounds a little bit deeper, right? Here's the original.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up.
Pretty cool sound. So what I do to stretch that even farther is I will add in some kind of stereo delay. For this kind of stuff, I like using something really simple, like in Logic, just the sample delay, because I can move my left and my right channel to different delays that are really, really fast. But all you need to do is move your left channel somewhere between, 2 milliseconds and 10 milliseconds. And then your right channel, same thing, somewhere between 2 milliseconds and 10 milliseconds. Just making sure that, they're at least a few milliseconds apart to create that stereo sound. And what that does is it just widens it a little bit more. Now, sometimes using delays like this would cause some phasing problems if you ever put your mix in mono. But because we've changed the tones of the original sound and we've added a little bit of detuning, it's not going to be nearly as bad as it would before. So I'm going to show you a quick before and after. So here's before.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning
And here's after.
what I called home is just where
Subtle.
I grew up.
But you can feel it move out just a little bit. It's like I panned it, 25% more to the left and the right.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I call.
And if I wanted to get more aggressive, all I would have to do is increase the delay.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up.
So now let's look at what this sounds like with the original vocal. Before.
And I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving.
Subtle, but you get some nice thickening, right? It just feels like doubling, but I didn't add any doubles. So that's it. That's all 6 different stereo effects I used in this. We added ambience, we added some stereo slapback delay, we added some chorusing, we added a ping pong delay, we added some micro shifting, and we added some secret sauce formant shifting. So now comes the fun part. Now we need to be listening to this in context of the mix, and I'm going to be taking down every one of these volume faders, and we are going to subtly mix them in until we're getting a good balance of all of the different sounds. Then once we do that, then I'm just going to mess with my volume fader on my actual stereoizing send, just to get the overall volume sitting exactly where I want it to. So let's do exactly that. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm just going to turn everything down real quick. And I'm just going to go over to my mixer, just so that it's easier to see everything. So now for the fun part. Let's listen.
I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning what I call.
Okay, that feels pretty good to me. That balance is sitting nicely. One cool thing about this is you can already tell just the difference in width and thickness and just general tone, having all of these different layers of stereo effects had versus just having one layer, like me just throwing the ambience on and then me throwing the stereo slapback on. There's a really huge difference. This is why I say this kind of layering, it's the trick. It's the thing that no one really thinks about, that you need to add in a lot of subtle changes rather than just like one really big move and then move on. So now we're just going to listen, and I'm going to take my stereoize function all the way down and just slowly move it up.
I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up. I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where.
Turn the original down a bit.
I'm tired, 'cause I'm learning.
That's a cool sound. I like that. I like that a lot. So before,
I'm leaving, 'cause I'm learning what I called home is just where I grew up.
it blends so nicely. And because I pushed it up so high in the mix, I not only got a wider vocal, but I got a tone. I got something that is specific to this singer, something that's recognizable. And that's the other bonus part of this entire trick, is you can basically just create signature tones this way. By having one particular send, like my stereoize send, and then being able to create tons of send off of that, you can create your own tone chain. You can create your own effect chain. Really, this is something that I do on so many different mixes. When I have an artist who comes in and says, I don't want my vocals to just sound like my vocals. I want to have a sound. I want to have a tone. I want to have a vibe. Figuring out that vibe takes a little bit, but this system for figuring it out and mixing it in and then saving it to your DAW so that you can bring it up in all of your mixes is so helpful. So here's something important that I need to mention. This is just one small piece of the puzzle. If you're trying to get your mixes to just sound huge and exciting and ready for the public, you can get this perfect and you can still end up with an amateur sound if you're making mistakes in all these other areas. We actually have a solution to that. Rob Mazes, the founder of Musician on a Mission, he's put together a free workshop where he shares the 7 steps to making radio-ready music at home. He's created a whole new approach to home recording and mixing. It's going to help you do all this stuff so much faster. And it hasn't worked just for him. Over 60,000 people at the time of recording this video They've been through this workshop and they've seen results in their music and their mixes in just a few days. So now we are passing that on to you. If you want to learn the exact 7 steps that will take your mixes to a professional standard in under a year, and that will keep you from wasting precious time and precious money and precious effort on all the wrong things, then go and watch this free workshop now. It's really, really easy. Just click the link on screen or in the description below to get your own personal access. It's completely free and you're going to love it. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell and like and all that stuff that we have to say, because YouTube. We make tutorials and tips just like this one every week on this channel. We really would love to help you grow in any way we can. So that's going to be all from me. This has been Dylan Pines with Musician on a Mission. And remember, create regardless.